Welcome to Ladies of Another View on Back, and I'm here with Mary. We have a very special show today. We're here with Ross Kennedy. He's the founder of Fortis Analysis, and we're going to explain what that's all about. We're also going to be joined by the Grand Forks Mayor, Brandon Bochenski. He's listening right now, and then we're going to bring him on. This show is going to be about a very controversial plan going on in Grand Forks right now, where they're talking about they're going forward with the Chinese Fufeng Group's building a corn processing plant there, and there's some controversy and questions, and not everybody agrees.
Sounds
as usual.
pretty innocent.
Well,
who doesn't need a corn plant?
It does, especially in North Dakota, right? What's not to like about corn? But there are some things that make people nervous because it's a Chinese company. So, Ross, why don't you explain what is the Fortis Analysis Group, and how did you get involved in this?
Yeah, so Fortis Analysis started last year as something that was an outgrowth of a lot of independent private consulting work that I was doing to private sector companies, to public sector entities, elements within the federal government, other state governments. And a lot of that is built around sort of what has emerged for us in the United States as a very hot button issue, particularly since COVID, which is that of supply chains and how that impacts our economic and national security. And it was, I've been doing this a long time. I've been working in logistics and supply chain since 2006, and it's been very much directed into agriculture, food, and energy markets, and also a lot of public sector work. It could be humanitarian, logistics and supply chain work for the military. Global war on terror has kind of, in some way, pressed a lot of people into service outside of uniform. And so combining those two things together, post-COVID, made an awful lot of sense. And so the goal is to really understand, pick a few things here and there around the U.S. that impact our national security or are directly related to where the world is really going here, sort of in a post-COVID world, as it were, as we begin to emerge from that, and what that impact will be on the United States and our communities and families and companies.
So then why don't you explain to us right now, what is the fear?
Well, there's a lot of fears. At the big picture scale, we've really, with Trump being elected in 2016, sworn in 2017, pretty soon after that, we begin to come into some level of low-level conflict with China. They are one of our largest trade partners. They're not our largest. A lot of people think they are. That's Canada and Mexico. But they are certainly a major source for us of a lot of things that we utilize in our day-to-day life, including some things people may not know. Pharmaceuticals is a big thing that we get from there, as well as food and feed ingredients, of which this Fufeng project blends right into that. And so as we have, the trade war started, and then we had the phase one trade deal, which was maybe a bit of an attempt to kind of cool everybody's jets a little bit. Let's try to find some way to work forward together. And the United States largely adhered to our piece of the phase one trade deal. China did not. They bought what they needed in terms of corn and soybeans and things like that. But for the most part, the United States played ball and China did not. And so now we're seeing an evolution in sort of a post-Trump era where we're trying to figure out we had this adversarial thing happening, we had the tariffs, we had all these issues, and now we're all figuring out in the supply chain and logistics world, what is this going to be? What is the risk of, you have Chinese President Xi Jinping, who is very strongly nationalist, in the same way Trump was a very nationalistic American president, and he holds a number of cards that we don't have, one of which is our significant manufacturing dependence on them. We have less ability on a lot of things to source from elsewhere, and they have some optionality. So if they don't want to buy soybeans from the U.S., they have the ability to, for example, buy them from Africa or from Brazil, which is one of their top trade partners. We can't go many other places to get our phones made, right? Because even a lot of the companies that are not necessarily Chinese, they utilize a heavy amount of Chinese manufacturing in their operations. So they have some significant optionality that we don't have. And what we're seeing now is a lot of things that we said, hey, maybe we need to start pulling these out of China, we need to start making them here, we need to start doing these things for ourselves, or pulling them out of China, putting them into places like Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia. What we're seeing is Chinese companies have adapted to this post-trade, this post-tariff world, as it were, and you're not seeing Vietnamese companies setting up factories in Vietnam to ship stuff to the U.S. They're not taking that opportunity. You're seeing Chinese companies move out of China into Vietnam, establish their operations there to get around the sanctions and tariffs. And now in the case of, I think the Fufeng Group, what we're seeing is a bit of an evolution of that strategy, a hybrid of that with some Belt and Road type things that China's been doing since 2013, and they're bringing it to the United States to be close to our stockpiles of energy and corn.
And so what specifically about the plant in Grand Forks concerns you?
Well, there's a few things. On the surface, like you said, it's somewhat innocent. It's a corn processing facility, right? And that doesn't seem like a big deal. It's essentially a big distillery when you really think about it. And certainly I'm a fan of distilleries and try to visit them whenever I can. But this is a little bit different. And the biggest issue, of course, and it's one that I think that the mayor who can hear us talking here, and I know and I feel for him having to deal with this, being the mayor of a town that's close to an Air Force base. And that responsibility is not a big, that's not a thing to be taken lightly. And I don't think that the city does. But we do have this risk. We do have this risk of a foreign company coming in that will have some level of foreign nationals working in it, some level of technology and things that are opaque or hidden from us, located 13 miles away from an Air Force base. We have mechanisms, we have processes in place in the United States to vet and guard against some of these potential issues. And we haven't done that process. We haven't seen that here with this yet. And so it's hard to even quantify the true risk without having ever done that investigation and followed those processes that our civilian and our military, political leaders have to look into these things. But from a big picture standpoint, the ability to monitor and observe the activities of the base, the ability to gather information in the local community about the base, contractors, subcontractors, people who work on the base, not just airmen or colonels. And the other issue is that it's gotten very, very easy from a technological standpoint that the closer you get to an installation, particularly one like Grand Forks Air Force Base, which has a very heavy data element associated with it. There's a lot of digital communications and intelligence and surveillance work that's done from that base, both the uplink and the downlinks at the base, to the satellites, to the other planes and bases around the world. Being that close to the base, there is a real risk, not just of China, but of anybody, Americans too, that those signals could be in some way, you can kind of put the cup under the waterfall, so to speak, and begin to interpret that data. And even if you can't decrypt it, sometimes just the direction of where it's coming from to where it's going can give you an awful lot of information. So again, it's almost hard to truly quantify what the risk is, if it's nothing or if it's a lot or if it's somewhere in between, which is probably where the truth is. That's where we have to have that inquiry, we have to have that formal channel and engage all the stakeholders on the base, in the community, but also in Washington, D.C. and the various chains of command that exist to properly look at these things.
Wow.
Yeah, I have a question, but I'm afraid that it's going to be longer than a minute. So, because a big concern is we're worried about communist China. It's not the Chinese we're afraid of, we're worried about the government, and is this business connected to that? We have 30 seconds. Is that a concern of yours?
Yeah, I mean, quite simply, there's three reasons really, and I'll make them very, very quick. One is that anybody doing business in China, particularly at the level of influence and revenue that Fufeng Group does, they've got 40 plus entities in China. When you're doing that level of work there, you're doing so with the blessing and mandate of the government. Two, the founder of the company is a member of the Chinese Communist Party, has served the Chinese Communist Party in a legislative role. And the third thing is that one of the entities, one of the subsidiary companies of Fufeng actually is in a joint venture, in a business relationship with COFCO, which is the Chinese state-owned entity.
We're going to be joined right now with Grand Forks Mayor Brandon Bochenski. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate that we can really have a dialogue about what is going on, help everybody understand. And and then you two will have your chance to go, you and Ross will interact with one another. But for now, Mary and I have some questions. And my first is, who brought this deal to you to build a corn processing plant from the Fufeng Group in China? How did that come to you?
Right, so that started with the North Dakota Department of Commerce. So they've got, the company had reached out to them and was seeking RFPs. So they asked us if we had the infrastructure ability to feed it on a wastewater and a water feed. So from there, we sent back an RFP through our Grand Forks Economic Development Corporation.
Interesting. So then I guess of all the places in the world, why Grand Forks, North Dakota?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. From our understanding, there was about 40 companies or 40 cities across kind of the Midwest region that had put in the RFP for this processing plant. So with Grand Forks being one of them. From the company, what we understand is there was kind of three things. You have outside of Tharaldson, there's not a lot of corn processing plants in the area. We have corn, but we have to ship it a long distance. We also recently were going to have the ability to have natural gas. And the third thing was just the ease to work in the state of North Dakota. Very business-friendly state, both at the state level and locally here in the city.
Okay, so I have a question. I was just down last summer. I was in Texas at a freedom rally, basically, and it was the Ag Commissioner of Texas, and it looked like China wanted to go ahead and buy, I want to say it was 30,000 acres, and they were going to put up a wind tower. And he said, absolutely not. China will not own any piece of property in Texas. Now, why should we sell land? I mean, because we're not just building a building and letting them rent that building. Why are we selling land to China?
So that's a good thing about the state of North Dakota. I think it's one of 5 states actually that does not allow China to buy farmland. So under state century code, which was passed by the legislature, they can purchase land if they're going to put in a development, industrial development on that property. So it would be a greenfield type of development. So it does allow for some flexibility there. But as a state level, I think we've done a good job protecting our farmland from being purchased.
Okay, so I want a little clarification here. You've done a good job protecting the farmland, but aren't they purchasing it? I mean,
yeah, so they have to convert the farmland. There's certain stipulations. It has to be, and this land is very close to the city. It's within our flood protection and accessible to utilities. But there's certain stipulations. They have to have an industrial development on that property. I don't have the exact century code, but that is the only way that they would be allowed to purchase land if they're essentially building an industrial development there.
what does our North Dakota congressional delegation think about this? Are they gung-ho? Do they have reservations?
I think it's a mix. I've talked to some that are supportive. Obviously, you have legislators that are in the ag economy and see this as a win. But I'm sure there's some that have concerns too. So it's a balance. I don't know the exact numbers, but certainly heard from people on both sides.
You probably have heard that Senator Kramer is not excited about it, and he thinks that it being a Chinese company and all, that we should pass on this and maybe go with something safer. What's your reaction to that?
Senator Kramer's been great. We have a good relationship. He actually forwarded us a contact. So a gentleman that he had worked with, he's actually the Deputy National Security Advisor that was under Trump. Now he does private sector consulting. He was actually the one that wrote the China policy for the Trump administration. So we've been in contact with him and his consulting firm, and it's been very helpful. So he identified a number of different things, like you talk about CFIUS, so the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and we had questions about that a greenfield agribusiness opportunity that doesn't fall under CFIUS guidelines, so it's not something that's reviewed by them. He mentioned that there's 19 industries that the White House has on their watch list sector for these types of Chinese investment, and the intelligence agency also has 5 different sectors that they watch as well. And that this type of business is not on those lists currently. And he mentioned that, on the national security front, wouldn't be a traditional red flag that's been brought up, but they're looking into it. On top of that, we've reached out to the base immediately when this happened. We've also reached out to the FBI. They didn't have any initial concerns. They offered to come up and give us an unclassified briefing on just behaviors or situations that we would need to watch out for going in the future. So we've been trying to do a number of things in the due diligence front to be prepared if in fact the plant does end up coming.
So are you saying that the United States Air Force does not have concerns of the Chinese owning land right next to their air base? And not only that, but we also have the largest drone school in the United States at UND. They have absolutely no concerns at all?
I reached out to them, and I guess I would put it this way: they haven't relayed concerns back at this point. Grand Forks has traditionally had, some Chinese presence here with the university. They've got, contracts with Air China to do flight training. We've got Cirrus Aircraft in town, which is a Chinese-owned manufacturer of airplanes. So there's a number of pieces that have been here long before, I got into office, and it's something that I'm sure that they've been cognizant of in the past as well.
I understand that the citizen petition was turned in 3,217 signatures and then some, just to give them a cushion, against the plant going in there. So what does that mean? Is it going to be put up for voters? Where does that go?
So the city attorney is reviewing it now. I think it's been a great conversation in the community. We've got to hear from a lot of people. I think this is great. Like you said early in the segment, trying to get the information out there to people is always difficult. You need people to get engaged, and that has happened. So it's been good. So he's going to review that and see what the process is in the next step going forward.
Where are you right now when you say the next step going forward? Because this isn't a done deal yet, right? Are you still exploring? Where are you at?
Right. No, I think that's a good point. So we initially kind of got to the stopping point. The company is interested in being here, but a lot of money needs to be spent. There's other concerns too, like environmental, odor, traffic, the usual concerns that you're going to have when a plant of this magnitude comes into town. So we set up a development agreement, which allowed all these items. There's, I think, 20 plus conditions that need to be satisfied before a ground would ever break or they'd ever be issued a building permit. So we're in the process of doing that. And the reason we wanted a development agreement is if something comes forward that makes this project not able to go forward, we have a letter of credit we can draw on from the company at a U.S. bank. So we're not having to pay, an estimated $1.5 million to do all the studies when it comes to environmental and third-party studies. We're just not taking the company's word for it. So we're in the development agreement phase right now. We're kind of vetting out all these conditions.
All right, so I just still find it alarming. I really do. I just don't think the Chinese should own any land in North Dakota whatsoever, or in America for that matter. But you say that there weren't any traditional red flags. A red flag's a red flag, don't they? Don't you think they need to be investigated?
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. And that's the process right now that we're looking at. It is concerning. We're not saying that there's no concerns. Our two economies are the largest economies in the world. We did $697 billion worth of trade back and forth in 2021 between us and China. We rely heavily on a lot of their manufacturing. So just like Mr. Kennedy had said earlier, a strategy needs to be created and move forward because we've got large economies that are really intertwined on a lot of different levels.
And I think for some North Dakotans, if they remember, 10 years ago, there was that fake diploma scandal at Dickinson State University, which had like a sister partnership school in China. And then the Confucius Institute shut down right away. And we had up to 700 fake diplomas or false students being enrolled, and I'm sure you're aware of it, at Dickinson State University. And we think, okay, wait a minute, what's going on here? That we can't go into these relationships with a communist country without our eyes wide open. And I really question if we even should get into a relationship with them. So we talked about the pros and cons, and I want to let you two maybe interact and because you don't necessarily are coming to the same conclusions on everything.
Sure.
Ross, why don't you go ahead and ask Brandon what your concerns are? Maybe let him respond.
Hi, Mayor. It's an honor to get to talk to you. I know I made one visit, I guess, to council chambers, I should say. I know you were in, I believe, Washington, D.C., you and city administrator. So it sounded like that was a productive visit, and that's good. I think, right, that's where it starts, is that engagement at all levels, up and down. I guess kind of the first question I had was, you said you were engaged with, it was probably Matt Pottinger, at least based on the description, on the national security side. Matt is a senior fellow, or excuse me, he's the director of the China program at the Foundations for Defense of Democracy. They released a monograph, I guess would be the best way to put it, back in November that talked about Chinese influence at the subnational level, that is a strategy that the CCP employs, is to try to get into business deals or relationships with, in some way at the below federal level, kind of specifically with the target of circumventing a lot of those protocols that we have that maybe aren't as robust at the state or local level. Is that something that you and Mr. Pottinger discussed in terms of, kind of trying to understand, the risk, I guess, associated with getting a year and a half into this process, before anybody in DC has kind of been involved? He is a fantastic voice on this, and if he's said it's good to go, then that certainly bears some credibility.
Yeah, and I think that's we can obviously thank Senator Kramer. Senator Kramer's a huge China hawk, and I think we've got the right guy that's taken a look at it for us. And I'm not going to go on here and say that the federal government, that I don't have some concerns about how things have operated there in the last number of years. But no, I do think we got a good resource there, and it's been very helpful.
What about this being a U.S. company? Because I've heard some concerns that they're not really, that they have like a USA branch, but they're not really operating as a U.S. company. They really are completely connected with the communist government.
Yeah, well, I mean, as foreign companies do business in the U.S., they'll set up U.S. subsidiaries, and this company has, at least through their branch in the Fufeng USA, under that umbrella, and hire a number of Americans to work for them. So that's largely who we've been working with. But there is a parent company that is the Fufeng Group Limited, which is based out of China.
And then how about the human rights, I guess, of the Chinese people? There's such a deficiency as far as how we are here in America versus the Chinese people. I guess, has that ever been thought about?
Yeah, I'm assuming you're asking me, and that's, there's a few things that would obviously be huge showstoppers. If we found out that this company was engaged in any of that activity, that would be an immediate, stop to this project. And also, if there's further aggression, if China ends up invading Taiwan or anything like that, I mean, that would certainly be a showstopper and cause, obviously bigger problems in the U.S.
I appreciate you saying that, because we're taking another look at China since the whole invasion of Ukraine.
And let's not forget COVID too.
And and their connection with Russia, that I appreciated. It sounds like you are keeping your eyes open. Not everybody is agreeing on the level of comfort, because, I mean, I have to be honest with you. I'm not a high-level government official, but I would just be real uncomfortable doing business with a communist government. I mean, how does that come into play?
Well, and that's the hard part. You've got Chinese company, and certainly a company of this size is a different magnitude in China. And is there a separation? And I think it's always a tough question. And I think the hard part in this is you kind of get into that argument of, okay, trying to separate good Chinese immigrants that are come here and giving value to our country, and the 1% that may not be doing that and may be involved in other activities. So it's definitely a challenge to try to separate all those different moving parts and to not come off on this in any way that we're judging the people, that we're judging the communist government is what we're judging here.
Thank you for saying that. I'm so glad you said that, because it can be misconstrued that, oh, we don't like Chinese people. We love Chinese people. We're worried about them because they suffer a lot of human rights, crimes against them. So thank you for saying that, Mayor Bochenski. Ross, did your company do business with Fufeng before? How did you become familiar with them before you heard about this?
So Fufeng, with my background in agribusiness, and I started my career, for example, at Archer Daniels Midland, which is actually a competitor of Fufeng on a number of amino acid and corn, processed corn ingredients, xanthan gum and MSG being two of the big ones. So these things kind of come across your radar from time to time. Someone who knows you, someone in the industry, whatever it may be, and they say, hey, what is this, or what's the impact here, or what's this likely to be? And there are a number of companies, like Fufeng is not the only company in China that makes these kinds of ingredients or engages in corn processing. There's numerous of them. And so it's not fair to say, well, just because they're doing this or just because that, you can begin to make assumptions, right? As far as their behavior on the international stage from a sales standpoint, like a few other Chinese firms in the same industry, they have been, sanctioned isn't the right word, but they have been certainly penalized with various forms of commercial and sort of economic, countervailing duties, anti-dumping duties, which are mechanisms governments use to say, hey, look, they're using some form of competitive advantage that they have. It may be cheaper labor, it may be cheaper energy costs, or significant subsidies in China, and they're selling into the United States market at far below levels that our own manufacturers can sustain price-wise, because maybe it's a little bit more expensive to do business in the U.S. with our extra regulations and slightly higher standard of living and wages and all of that. Yeah. So once you begin to look into that sector, very quickly that group narrows from one company with one maybe plant somewhere to a company like Fufeng that has 6, 7, 8, 10 manufacturing facilities under a number of different subsidiaries in different parts of China. And when you begin to dig into what those are, then you realize that their subsidiaries are in Xinjiang, they're in Heilongjiang, which is in the north, they're in Inner Mongolia, they're in Lianyangong and Shandong provinces. They're in places that it makes sense that they're there because the coal power is cheap in a lot of those places. It makes sense that they're there because the labor's cheap. But then you get into the issue of you have this presumption that the United States government has. A State Department issued last year some guidance on doing business in Xinjiang and said, look, you have to assume that the energy that they use to power their plants, you have to assume that if they're not employing forced labor in the factory proper, that they're certainly benefiting from it, because if you have your, you have your prison farms and your detention camps that they take these prisoners, they do go out and engage and grow, the product. They do bring them back and put them in the grain bins. And so you have forced labor involved in the manufacturing of the energy and the manufacturing of the commodity itself. So even if it's not inside the factory proper, even if you've got an audit that says, hey, look, we treat our workers great, the United States does operate on a presumption now that if the factory is there, they have to prove that, certifiably, that every part of their supply chain and every subsidiary company is not doing this, or there's a great risk of that company being severely sanctioned. And so it's one of those things that, because a company has gotten away with it to this point, doesn't mean we don't need to dig into those issues. And the sanction risk to not only to Fufeng, but also to the U.S. subsidiaries, the sanction risk to anybody in the private sector side or in the public sector side that's involved in that company in the U.S. or overseas, also runs the risk of falling under those sanctions, whether it's financial, criminal, civil penalties, whatever it may be. If they know that the company could possibly be engaged in this and they continue to do business with them, then they are presumptive, they're assumed to gain some benefit from that as well. So it's a major, major risk. Even if we don't know for sure, the United States government is now assuming if you have an operation in Xinjiang, that financial benefit flows to all the global subsidiaries of that company or sister companies, and that anybody downstream of that benefits from it too.
Mayor Bochenski, what are your thoughts on that? Has this been a consideration?
Yeah, I think it's a concern. I mean, we have an ethical trade audit that the company that they share with their U.S. Companies now that they do business with, and we're having that looked into, because you want to make sure that that's done legitimately, that the third party is legitimate, and those things are always tough to figure out when you're talking about a country that's 15 time zones from here, how many thousands of miles. So definitely something that we have considered.
We had a reporter go out on the streets because not a lot of North Dakotans don't really know what's going on.
Well, let's take a peek at it.
Why do you oppose a vote? Why can't we vote? Do any of you support a referendum among Grand Forks citizens? I say no. You're all traitors. You're all cowards. And you're all sellouts.
Emotions run high in Grand Forks these days between North Dakotans and their elected officials. Residents say city leaders are rolling out the red carpet for a Chinese-owned corn processing plant. But residents have too many concerns, and that's why they're taking the law into their own hands.
I am Michael Coachman, and we, the people of Grand Forks City and the county of North Dakota, hereby informing you that you are placed, you, the mayor, Brandon, Bochenski, Danny Williams, if I misspell your name or pronounce your name, sorry about that. Katie, Brett, Jennifer Mock, Kyle, Dana, Ken Veen, Todd, Phelan, Joseph Quinn, and Dan Zgodowski as citizens arrest on the following charges.
It's a controversial issue that's generating a lot of energy out of Grand Forks, but in the rest of the state,
this is the very first time I've ever heard of this issue.
No, I haven't heard anything about it.
Beulah residents Linda and David Sazinski pride themselves with keeping up to date on the issues and stories that make up the state's news. They first learned of the proposed Fufeng plant from Beck News and say opportunities for economic development are important, but at what cost?
The rest of North Dakota, I mean, we're all in this together, so sure, we want economic development, but we also need to be cognizant of where that development is coming from.
With everything going on in the world, and I would be a little bit skeptical about, well, you've got an Air Force base right there.
The Sazinskis say security is at the top of their concern list, and they're not alone. But Grand Forks Mayor Brandon Bochenski has said that complicated national security and geopolitical issues should not fall on city leaders.
Well, if they're admitting they're not security experts, I think we better get the experts involved.
Mayor Bochenski says security concerns rise to higher government levels, including the state's congressional delegation. But Senator Kevin Cramer has expressed his skepticism over the deal.
I think with Cramer and his questioning or reluctance about this program. I think that in itself is a big flag, a huge flag.
They also question what impacts the new facility would have on cooperatives, ecology, and state taxpayers. But perhaps the question that's not been answered is why North Dakota is turning to a Chinese-owned company to build such a plant.
North Dakotans are very trusting. Maybe we're too trusting.
Wow.
Mayor Bochenski, what do you think about that?
Well, it's a hot button. I mean, just look at the world right now. I spent 8 years playing in Kazakhstan, playing hockey, and now seeing some of the friends that I knew and have to deal with this Russian invasion. It's tough. There's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot of distrust, and I think when people hear the name China and Chinese, it does strike a chord right now. So it's something that we have to work through and something we have to think about and find what the best solution is for not only Grand Forks but the whole state, and in this case, the country.
I guess I just don't think that we should sell land to China. That's just I'm drawing a hard line. There's just too much going on. I don't think they're trustworthy. I don't think they have human rights at their best interest. They can bring people over and hire them, put them in the plants. We would never know. Of course, they're going to have inspections, but they're usually announced. And it's like, I just don't think we can trust China in the U.S. right now. That's just my opinion.
The reason I want, go ahead.
And I think, the State Department, talking about employees, to get an H-1B visa, you have to have a specialty occupation. So you can't get a work visa to come over and work at a factory. So I do think that those concerns that are going to bring people over is a little bit of a distraction. We do have to focus, and I think it's important to focus on, the main things. And that's where I worry when some people come, like Mr. Coachman did. There are big concerns that we need to vet and we need to look at when you're kind of, saying you're going to arrest everybody involved, including the senators and the governor. You missed the end of his speech. I think that takes away from some of the real issues that we really need to look at deeper.
That's why I so appreciate that the two of you were willing to come on together, because I did read a little bit about that city council meeting, and there was a little bit of a hysteria. That I wanted to separate that from the facts that we're concerned about, because I truly believe you both are concerned about the same things, but you have different areas of expertise. You have some inside information, and then you have concerns, though, even though you appreciate that they're looking into it. Do you feel like they're looking into it to the level that you think they should?
I think I have two primary concerns moving forward. The first is that, the CFIUS review is the primary mechanism we have. It's not the only mechanism we have. And at the risk of, maybe crossing a little bit of swords with Matt Pottinger, who's far smarter on pretty much everything than I am, particularly as regards China issues, CFIUS does have two provisions. It's not just the covered technology sector, which are what we call, critical technologies. It's not just that, although there is a bill in front of Congress that I believe Senator Ernst from Iowa pushed forward, called the Food Security as National Security Act, which would actually bring a lot of agriculture and manufacturing technologies from the food sector covered up under CFIUS. But you also have something called covered real estate transactions. And that one's very important, and it hasn't been looked into. It's very hazy. There hasn't been a lot of CFIUS work around that, but it is a voluntary thing. It's not mandatory that the city or the Fufeng or anybody reach out to CFIUS and say, hey, look, we're considering this deal. It is voluntary. But if CFIUS decides to take it up and review it and they issue an adverse finding, it looks very bad for a lot of people involved. But covered real estate transactions means any purchase of property within 100 miles of a designated military installation. And the law very clearly spells out what those installations are, who the responsible parties are for notifying CFIUS, and having that. And this deal, at least from a proximity standpoint, at least from a surface level reading of what a covered real estate transaction is, actually does roll up under that second provision of CFIUS. Your other issue that you have, and this is something that I'm always concerned about when you talk about the very kind of hazy nexus, if you will, of economic interest, national security, political interest at all levels up and down, is, the citizens, you had 5,200 signatures in a city of, it's got 45,500-ish voters, right? You're talking a little under, what was that, 11% or something, or, of the voters in the city said, hey, we want to put this on a referendum. So if it goes to a referendum, then my concern really is that the work will be done properly at the local level. I do think that the city officials and everybody involved will give this, will let democracy sort of have its say locally, good, bad, or indifferent as far as my view goes. My concern is what happens at the state level or at the federal level if there are vested interests that kind of are able to come in and bigfoot this deal and sort of violate the will of the people locally. There are other places that a plant could be built. I get that everybody's really far down the road, but if Fufeng decides to pull out and go somewhere else, that letter of credit that the city has is said to protect them. This is a $600-700 million project. There's a lot of money involved in it. I have no idea where Fufeng USA would get $600 or $700 million. I have to assume it's coming from the parent company, at the international level. But the city's not at risk at putting a pause on this, running that 45 to 60-day process that CFIUS takes, continuing to do some of these other things on the side. Let the people have their say in June, and then let's see where we stand. So, again, I think the mayor, I think the city administration, I think they will all do this right. My concern is that maybe this is, only the first or second battle in a much longer one to come. And I do want to make sure that not only are we checking all the boxes locally or at the state level, we're checking them at the national level too. And I don't want to see this thing get built or half built, or we get far enough down the line that homework we could have done now to save everybody a lot of heartburn, we didn't do, and now you've got a half-developed project with no plant, or possibly even sanctions hitting after the plant's built and operating. What do you do with that asset then? So I think the cart's well in front of the horse here, and that's really been my big concern, and kind of blowing the whistle on this, is saying, hey, look, there's so much smoke here, we really need to maybe take a pause and look for the fire.
No, I appreciate his viewpoint. I think he makes some good points. One of the benefits, we've got a phenomenal city attorney, and one of the benefits of one of the things he put in the development agreement is the infrastructure that would benefit this project. They're going to make a payment up front before we even start digging that any of that infrastructure in. As far as sanctions, there certainly is a risk at some point if sanctions or worse, we end up in a war or some conflict with China, where an asset would have to be seized. There certainly is risk there. I place that probably a little more on company risk. Obviously, if you've got a half-built plant, there's opportunities for somebody else to come in, pennies on the dollar, and build a plant there. You don't want to rely on that. To me, I would see the risk if something got shut down after the plant was operational, and you've got a workforce that's already in there, and they suddenly lost those jobs. There'd be risk there, but you would think with a fully built plant, you'd be able to find a buyer at that point. So he makes some good points and something to think about. So appreciate it.
So is that plant going to be subsidized by U.S. taxpayer money?
So right now there's no infrastructure going out to the plant. So had there been infrastructure there, this would be a lot easier process. So the city needs to make some upgrades to our water treatment plant, which is already in our CIP, so our capital improvement project list. So we're going to have to speed that up. I think the biggest thing, there's no direct tax dollars going to Fufeng, but the biggest thing I think that people get heartburn is on the pilot agreement. So there'd been a tax abatement that was put together. Right now, this property pays about $5,500 a year in property taxes. Once the plant would be built, it'd pay about $5.8 million a year. So we've got a 20-year step up to that full $5.8 million. But year one, they'd end up paying $927,000 estimated. So you have a big increase. If nothing happens there, it just continues to pay the $5,500. So there's some huge benefits to taxpayers in carrying some of that burden for property tax in a city that's really struggling with our schools right now. We've got a massive amount of deferred maintenance. Certainly our county could use the money too. So there are some benefits on that side, definitely.
But see, I don't think that we should take money just because, it's going to bring money to the economy. We are still at risk. We have the Air Force Base there. And you mentioned the 100 miles. Well, maybe it's almost 150 miles. We have a B-52 bomber, or the B-52s are out of Minot. I guess, to me, there's just such a big risk for the bottom line of bringing in more money. There's other ways to make money.
I've got to say, there must be a lot of pressure on you along that line, is you've got your citizens and you've got a lot of people concerned in signing petitions. But like Mary says, you don't want to sign a deal with the devil because you need the money here. But it is a lot of money. You're looking at the opportunity. You have a lot on your shoulders here.
You got to look at the long term.
Right. So go ahead and respond.
It is difficult. You've got a very large company that wants to make a big investment and believes in your community enough to do so. And there's benefits there, but there's risks too. And you've got to weigh both. It's been heavy on me. It's been a tough time for my family. I'm not sleeping a whole lot trying to find the answer, but that's part of what I signed up for and part of what I'm trying to do as the mayor.
I like your sign behind you to pray, because I kind of think that we really need to employ that right now, because this is a big decision. This is a big decision with long-term effects, and we can't always see into the future, but we sure can look at the clues around us. And I
China
mean,
is not our friend. China is not our friend. Bottom line.
Yeah. In Grand Forks, like I said, we've got a complicated past. We have a large manufacturing facility that employs 300. That's Cirrus aircraft that went through the CFIUS back in 2011 and
It
was
doesn't
approved.
make it right, though. It doesn't make it right to do it again.
No. Sorry, I didn't. I cut you off there. Anyway,
No, that's all right.
it's our complicated past. That's all I'm pointing out.
where would you recommend if people want to learn more? I know the more they learn, sometimes the more headaches you have. But I wonder, like some people that are hearing about this for the first time, how can they dig into this and keep track of what's going on?
Yep. So I would say that a good place would be on the city's webpage. So you've got all the meetings, you've got a lot of notes from there. So you can really dig deep into the details there. So grandforksgov.com, there's a Fufeng tab there. And it goes beyond just economic benefits, and it gets into water usage, it gets into infrastructure build out and spending, a lot of the things that taxpayers would be concerned about beyond the China factor.
Okay, so we have less than 2 minutes. So we'd like you both to have your final thoughts. What would you like to tell us or tell our viewers?
I know the thought has been that I'm an opponent purely on this, just on the China issue. I mean, I am and I'm not. I do want to see the state of North Dakota have this. I do think that there is a place. I do think that the stakeholders who are saying, yeah, we need value-added processing, additional capacity in the state, we should do that. My concern is that American companies have not stepped forward, but they didn't know they could necessarily, or they didn't maybe occur to them. We're 60 to 65% dependent on animal feed ingredients from China, these amino acids that are made in China and brought here. We're 50 to 95%, even 100% dependent for almost all of the major vitamins that go into our mixes for our animals. So it's a risk for us that we're not doing this in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question maybe to the mayor, to anybody is if an American company were to step forward and say, look, we'll pick up the mantle, we'll pick up everything with it and run with it, is that even something that would be considered? Or do we risk this project dying here and maybe going to a different state because someone's like, hey, that's a great idea?
You have about 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
There's nobody in the world that would rather have ADM or Cargill calling him right now saying we'd love to step in and make this thing happen there. Nobody in the world that would want that more. And I think that's another good point. I mean, if the plant doesn't get built in Grand Forks, they're going to look for another city to build it in. It's not here or China. It's going to be here or a different city, and they may go through the same thing there. But having a larger strategy, as Mr. Kennedy says, is vastly important, and I think something that should be looked into.